Welcome to Old Path Ministries and our study through the book of 1 Samuel. We get to chapter 23 today, and a pretty recognizable, I guess you could say, part of history, and a lot of repetition in the way of how Saul interacts towards David. And there are some, I guess you could say, kind of subtle things that you'll notice in this as we look at it, things that really differentiate how Saul proceeded and did the things that he did and how David would do the things that he would do. So there's some really, really good things for us to learn from this history here, especially how it is that David approaches the difficulty that he's in and how when he comes before the Lord, the way that he comes before the Lord. It's really instructive for us. And boy, I wish so many times in my life, I wish I had been as careful about making sure that I knew what the Lord wanted before I acted. And David's very good at that, and he's totally the counter of what you would see in the person of Saul. So I'll point that out when we get there. But we start at chapter 23, so let's have a word of prayer and we'll take a look at the text. Father, we thank you as we come to your word. We ask that you would help us to understand, though we are reading so much history in the history of Israel in the early time of the kings, yet there are things that we can always glean from this, and how it is that the people of God should conduct themselves, as opposed to when the people that are called by your name, the nation of Israel, when they would reject and they would do the things that they should not do. It helps us in our understanding of how to walk rightly before you, making wise decisions, and making sure that we're always in a place of being pleasing before you. So, Lord, I pray that you would instruct us again through your word. We give you thanks and pray that you would glorify yourself through the teaching of your word. And we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Okay, so chapter 23 begins this way. So they told David, saying, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and they are robbing the threshing floors. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go and attack the Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. Now, I'm going to put up a map right here, because it's one. Go ahead and take a screenshot of it, because it'll be helpful for down the road in the rest of the chapter. You'll be able to reference it back, because there are a lot of place names in this section that we'll be going through today. And if you're interested in the geography of it, but most of this you can pretty much see from where Saul would be to where David was going to be going is pretty much on a north to south kind of a route. And so Saul would be doing the things that he would be doing much more in the northern part. And so from Jerusalem and above, and David is doing much more of what he's doing down to the south around the Dead Sea and even into Moab. So we're pretty sure that we've got a good idea of where most of these places are. Some of them are a little bit kind of hidden from us, but we can get kind of a good understanding that David is kind of to the south, directly below where Saul would be, and but he's kind of on the parallel of like the middle part of the Dead Sea, and it becomes pretty obvious when you look at the map. The corridor that's there, clearly there's roads that go from north to south, and it is the same to this day. So those roads, it's an interesting thing when you get to Israel, you'll see that the areas and the roads that are current are all along where the ruins are through the centuries and even through the millennia. And so what people do, they still continue to upgrade the roads from ancient times. It makes sense. If they were there was a reason, and civilization was along these roads. And so through the ages, they tear down, they build up, but they still kind of keep the same thoroughfares all up and down Israel in north, south, east, west. So pretty interesting at this point. David hears, and he's all the way down in Moab. Remember, we got that from last week. And he had gotten away and got out of the way, if you will, because of the threats of Saul. He had got his family and everybody clearly out of what is in the within the borders of his modern day Israel. He had moved everyone kind of into what is modern day Jordan. And so all the area that Moses and Joshua had brought the children of Israel, or Moses, I should say, he was the focal point. But this is the same area that they went through on their way out of Egypt to come into the land in the first place, centuries before this. So Just kind of interesting history as you look back on it. Now, it tells us David inquired, and the Lord asked of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack the Philistines?" And the Lord said, "Go and attack the Philistines." But then notice David's men. They said to him, "Look, we are afraid here in Judah. Here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the enemies, or the armies rather, of the Philistines?" So basically, by this time, David's moved back towards the parts more in what is Judah to the south. It would be the tribe territory of Judah. And they're saying, "Look, David, you're telling us to go. We're afraid enough outside of what would be commonly the reach of Saul. Now you want us to go kind of into his backyard." He's very concerned about this. The guys are. So notice what David does. David then inquired of the Lord once again, and the Lord answered him and said, "Arise, go to Keilah, for I will deliver the Philistines into your hand." And David and his men went to Keilah, and they fought the Philistines. They struck them with a mighty blow, took away their livestock, and so David saved the inhabitants of Keilah. So, there's been a lot of speculation. If God had made David the king, then why did God not just remove Saul? And why go through all of this? And so the idea that David would be always constantly on the run and going on for so long, and all the intrigues and everything else, and the only real good explanation that you ever hear of it, and there's a lot of variations of it, but this would definitely be something that would test this man's character, and it would probably make him a better king for it, because nothing came easy to him in these early years that you'll see. But why God allowed Saul? Again, is it because he's testing Saul at the same time that he could work in the life of Saul, giving Saul the option? I mean, you could probably make a case for all of the above and a whole lot more. But the idea that Samuel was to say, "You're the king," and he anointed him as king while Saul was still in place years before this, and yet he allows Saul to continue on and for David to really be tried in this. But think about the testimony that David has, and it really comes out in his Psalms. David just realizes, more times than I can count, God has been there for me, and that dependence that David would have upon the Lord. But what I want to make sure we catch from this, David didn't have any problem going directly to the Lord. What should I do? And if objections were brought to him that maybe would even make him question, did I hear the Lord right? He didn't have any problem going right back to the Lord a second time. And I so love that about him. He does it so often through his lifetime that we have record of. And this is where I was saying it's good sometimes to study the history of these things, because it's so instructive to us today. Here's the hypothetical question that people might have. Why do you bother taking time in the Old Testament? Why bother with that? It's the history of Israel, has nothing to do with the church. I love to be able to reply to them and say, don't you learn anything from this? Isn't it great to make sure that you genuinely know the mind of the Lord before you act? And so in this case, he's got the lives of hundreds of men in his hand. Don't you want to make sure that you've got God's instruction direct and you know exactly what it is? And any objections could be dispensed with because God makes himself very, very clear. So in this case, there was never wavering in this. And there's another time when David senses that there's something. It's only in a few verses. David senses that something's wrong, and he's careful to go before the Lord and get real detail on this. So just hold on. We're going to get there in just a moment. Verse 6. So it happened when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, fled to David at Keilah, that he went down with an ephod in his hand. And so the ephod was what he would wear, and behind it was the stones, the Urim and the Thummim, and it would be how they could really find out and divine, if you will, what was God's will. He could answer. And so it was and remember this, it's not some weird relic kind of a thing, and it's not something that they developed on their own. Remember that it was God who gave the instruction to Moses. And this was something that first Aaron wore, and that God was the one who designed it. And it was designed in such a way that it was to represent the tribes of Israel because of the adornment on the front of it. But in behind it was where God would be able to, some would call them dice, there's stones, and it would be that God could answer by how those stones were taken out. You can read about it. It was God who had designed it, had it made according to his specifications, because this is the way that God chose. He would be able to speak through the high priest, or through this garment, this piece, this outer breastplate kind of a thing. So there were times when God would speak directly, and we would hear him. We would see the history of it would say that there were sometimes that God spoke audibly, and other times where he did it this way. In this case, this is how he's going to be speaking to David in this kind of question. So Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and so Saul said, God has delivered him into my hand, and he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. And so Saul called for the people together for war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. And first of all, again, this just kind of goes right to the heart of the sickness of Saul. Why does he want David dead so badly, aside from just his own weird psychosis and the fact that he's incredibly jealous of David? So he already knows that he's going to be taken out as king. Basically, he's probably wondered, I'm sure on more than one occasion, why hasn't it happened yet? But be that as it may, here's a guy who clearly has lost favor as far as God is concerned, and at this place, David is going to be that king. He knows it. And so you'll see that there is an episode coming up in the next chapter where that becomes even more obvious. So they call the people. Here's the long and the short of it. Saul hears that David has gone and done this. Notice again, he doesn't even care that David has run off the people who are looking to destroy the people of Israel. He's run off the Philistines and given, once again, great victory to David. He doesn't care about any of that. He just has this vendetta and wants David dead. Just a really insane guy by this time. So David knew that Saul plotted against him. He said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. So again, I want to hear from the Lord. What should we do? David asked, O Lord of Israel, your servant has certainly heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city for my sake. Will the men of Keilah deliver me into his hand? Will Saul come down and your servant be heard, or as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Now, he's answered one of his two questions. In this kind of implied is David saying, look, if Saul's going to come and besiege, and it's going to mean the death of all of these people, are they going to give me up rather than, go against the king here? And so God says, Saul's coming down. Notice what David does. Once again, here's one of those things. Lord, I have a question for you, and it's in two parts, and God only answers one of it. How often would people just move and not say, Lord, can I please know the other part of this? Look at what he does in verse 12. Then David said, but will the men of Keilah deliver me into and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will deliver you. So yes to both things. Saul's coming, and if he gets here before you're gone, the people of Keilah will give you up, even though you just saved them from the Philistines. Just think about how the fear of this was. Pretty insane stuff. And so the fear of, boy, is this a time that you say it? Here we are in the middle of January 2021, and we're just days away from the inauguration. And there are many people, especially conservative Christian people, who are wondering what's the government going to be like, because we're seeing little glimpses of it here and there. We already know by this time, if you're a biblical worldview holding Christian and you're dedicated to the Lord and to his word, and your life shows it, much of this world really can't stand you. So the interesting thing is, government as we would see it in their time, David looking at Saul, he's got all the power here, and he just wonders what will happen, and will they turn on us? And so there's a lot of people speculating that why it's a good thing and why I even brought it up in the first place is that even if we're worried about such things, have David's heart in this. Lord, what would you do? What should we know? And how would you lead us? So God never fails. Verse 13, David and his men, about 600 men in number, arose and they departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. And when it was told to Saul that David had escaped from Keilah, he halted the expedition. So, all right, he got away, and there's no reason for them to pursue. So it says David stayed in the wilderness strongholds, and he remained in the mountains in the wilderness of Ziph. And so this is to the south. Again, going back to that map, you'll see that it's to the south, and it's on the parallel of the middle part, if you will. If you're looking at a map and you see Ziph, just look to the right of the map and you'll see the Dead Sea, and it's about the upper third to halfway point if you look straight across, just so you get kind of an idea. So Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. So Saul, it's not for lack of trying. God just would not allow him to be successful, of course, because God knows what he's going to do with David, and Saul has already been replaced as the king in God's eyes. So he sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. And so David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life, and David was in the wilderness of Ziph in a forest. Jonathan, Saul's son, arose, and he went to David in the woods and strengthened his hand in God. What a cool thing. That's, I'm here to comfort you and all the rest. And what you see here is that Jonathan and David have been very, very close from the beginning of the relationship that we know about that they had. They're like brothers at this point. And here, once again, Jonathan says, you know, I guess if we were going to try to put it in modern terms, most of the conversations by this time are Jonathan saying to David, David, I know that my father is nuts. He's looking to kill you, but just don't let this come between you and me. That's what this discussion is going to be. And so it's like, hey, when he's gone and you're the king, remember us, you know. And David, of course, would have no intention of doing that. But this is again a way of they're pledging to one another. So a man from the tribe of Judah and a man from the tribe of Benjamin. These are neighboring lands. And so basically they're able to say, well, regardless of whatever Saul is up to and all of his weirdness, between you and me, Jonathan and David, man, it's a pact and it's for life. We're like brothers. I love this relationship. It's so cool. Well, it says, verse 17, and so he said to him, do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. Even my father Saul knows that. Isn't that interesting? So this is information that we get in this historical account that really Saul knows the whole thing. And of course, he's already accused Jonathan of this and threw the spear at him and all that. We know that from the other chapters, a couple of chapters back. So he knows this to be the truth. And so in verse 18, so the two of them made a covenant before the Lord, and David stayed in the woods, and Jonathan went to his own home. Now, then the Ziphites, that's the area where they are, they came up to Saul at Gibeah, saying, is David not hiding with us in the strongholds, in the woods, in the hill of Hachilah, which is on the south of Jeshimon? Now, again, this is the exact areas of this is not something that you could go put your finger right on it necessarily. We just know the geographical area of Ziph. And we think of this, it's almost like for us to think that Israel is bigger than it actually is. And if you figure that just for perspective size, the whole nation of Israel fits in Lake Michigan with a lot of room left over, if that gives you an idea. So to say that they're in one area, but then there is another area that somebody else is in and they're going to come against them, just think it's not that big of an area. So Ziph is the general location of the area. These are specific areas within, and they're very close in proximity to one another. So they came to him at Gibeah. You can see that in the map up to the north there. And they said, David's hiding with us. And the way it's written in English, is David not hiding with us? It's their way of saying, hey, look, he's among us. He's in the strongholds there. And so, in verse 20, now therefore, O king, come down according to all the desire of your own soul to come down, and our part shall be to deliver him into the king's hands. And so there's no reason for them to do this other than they think that this is going to benefit them somehow because Saul's the king, David's just somebody that he's after. They're looking to ingratiate themselves to the king, clearly. Verse 21, Saul said, blessed are you of the Lord, for you have had compassion on me. Now please go and find out for sure and see the place where his hideout is, and who has seen him in that place. For I am told he is very crafty. That just means that the Lord keeps taking him out of the way before you can get there, Saul. Now, see therefore, and take knowledge of all the lurking places where he hides, and come back to me with certainty, and I will go with you. And it shall be, if he is in the land, that I will search him out throughout all of the clans of Judah. So I don't care where I've got to go to. they basically know Ziph is in the tribal allotment of Judah. So they arose, they went to Ziph before Saul, but David and his men were in the wilderness of Maon, in the plain which is to the south of Jeshimon. So again, they just keep pushing further south from where they had started. And so when Saul and his men went to seek him, they told David. Therefore he went down to the rock, and he stayed in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard of it, that he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. And then Saul went, in verse 26, onto one side of the mountain, rather, David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And so David made haste to get away from Saul, for Saul and his men were encircling David and his men to take them. So this gives you kind of an idea, the difference in the size of the troops and the people who are with each. So if you could encamp or encircle around where David's guys are, David sees it, they're kind of setting a trap for us and they're going to encircle us. David's got to get out quickly. Well, a messenger came to Saul saying, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have invaded the land." And so it's God who gives the diversion, brings up the Philistines. It's an intervention, I'm sure. And again, this comes down to this really, really intriguing thing. If God wanted this done, he could have just taken Saul out entirely. But he doesn't do that. And so, again, there's a lot of reasons you could speculate, well, why didn't he just wipe out Saul and make it over with? And then here they're this intrigue of them coming after David over and over again. They're about to encircle them, and now Saul hears the Philistines have come into the land. And so Saul needs to make a decision. What's more important? To try to finish the deal with David, or am I going to lose my kingdom to the Philistines? And of course he picks the bigger of the two dangers. David's not a danger to him, and he really knows it. It's just petty jealousy and other weirdnesses, but he definitely sees the Philistines. They're an existential threat to the entire livelihood of the nation. So, came to Saul, they told him this, that Philistines are invading the land. Therefore Saul returned from pursuing David. He went against the Philistines, and so they called that place the Rock of Escape. That's what it became known as. This is the place where Saul was ready to encircle David with his people, and report came to him that the Philistines were there. He had to stop his pursuit and move back in the other direction. And so it became known as this place of escape. And so, verse 29, David went up from there and dwelt at the strongholds at En-gedi. Now, this is a place that I really, really love to go and to visit. En-gedi, I'm going to show some pictures of it that I took in one of the trips to Israel. And En-gedi is it's an area. And is it the exact same place where we're talking about? Could you go and look at the cave and all that? What you basically have are little canyons that are cut up into the mountains, and there are a number of them. But En-gedi is not a huge area per se. It overlooks the Dead Sea, and so we're talking about the lower areas. This is pretty well below sea level at this point where they are. And when you're at the Dead Sea, you're way below sea level. The interesting thing, though, you can see because of the erosion that the caves that are there are quite a bit above your head rather. They're 40, 50, 60 feet above the floor of the canyon. But at one time, they were up there, that was kind of street level. So the erosion has caused that. You see the same effect at Qumran, and where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those caves are no longer even able to be accessed in the normal sense. Many of them, I should say, not all of them. The older ones are higher up, and then, again, erosion washes things away. So with all of that said, they make their way to En-gedi. Now, En-gedi means that from where they were, you're traveling over the mountains. If you went directly to the east, your perspective, directly to the east, you're going to have to come down through the mountains to get to this, because En-gedi, once again, is pretty close to the floor of what is the Dead Sea. So it's below sea level, and the mountains around Israel are more than a couple of thousand feet above sea level. So that gives you an idea of the change that goes down. So in chapter 24, so it happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines, that it was told to him, saying, "Take note, David is in the wilderness at En-gedi." And then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all of Israel and went to seek David and his men in the rocks of the wild goats, and so in Gedi. Now it means it's not the low-lying area, it's up where the goats are, and we see them there too. Again, they're everywhere. All in throughout that canyon is where you'll see these goats, and they're pretty nimble. They'll watch you and they see you as you're going by, but they're easily able to go wherever you couldn't go quickly. And so they're still there. All those same types of animals still inhabit that particular part of the place. So you have a series of canyons in this area, any one of which could be it. And we don't know the exact cave because there are many caves there. So we don't know any of those specifics other than we know the general area. And it is very interesting when you walk up in there, you just realize this is the area where this took place. So it's very, very interesting when you're there to see it with your own eyes. So he took these 3,000 men. These are the best of the best. And so he came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. Yeah, that's what it sounds like. David and his men were staying in the recesses of that cave. Now, Saul doesn't know this, but he's going to have some privacy, not even realizing that David and his men are in that cave. Now, this is, as we see, it's an opportunity. Everybody knows this story. I'm sure, most people probably know this story. And we'll go ahead and read it. I won't narrate the whole thing. But wherever this happened, they're looking to probably go into the recesses of these canyons, but this seems like whatever the road was is an area where there was plenty of traffic. And so whatever that means, we don't have the slightest idea how far up into the canyon it was, but before going further in, this is where Saul takes his leave. And in verse 4 it tells us, so the men of David said to him, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as seems good to you. And David arose secretly, and what he did was cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now, this idea that they see, here's your opportunity, God has put him into your hands. They already know that David has been anointed as king. They also know that Saul has been removed as king. And remember, by this time, the guys that David has with him are pretty much those people, for any variety of reasons, were no longer just part of the normal day-to-day, congregation of Israel. So there were a lot of people that were kind of outcast at this point, and we get that from the previous chapters. So the people that he has are nothing like the ones that Saul has. These are trained, the best of soldiers. David doesn't have quite that same thing. And their counsel to him is, hey, God's put him in this cave, go take him out. Well, David is such a complex character, that's for sure. So he went and cut off a piece of his robe, and then now in verse 5 it says, now it happened afterward that David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe. Now that is the troubling, there's a speculation on that. Is troubling that he didn't go through and do what he should have done, or was it that it was disrespectful of Saul and who he was, or that it was kind of a way of just mocking him to do so? There's, again, all kinds of speculation, but we see David's heart in this whole matter. And he wants Saul to realize, I wish you no harm. Look, I could have done something to you, but I didn't. That's what David does. So he wants to make this known. So he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master. And this seems to be the biggest of his troubles. The Lord's anointed to stretch out my hand against him, seeing that he is the anointed of the Lord. Who am I that I would do that? Great heart that David has. Now think about this. David has already been anointed the king. He knows that this is his, eventually he's going to be the king of Israel. He already knows that. Samuel's told him that. But he also sees that as long as God has Saul in place, David's not going to take matters into his own hands. If it's God who's appointed him, then God's going to have to make the office open to him, and David's not going to take it in his hands. A, because it's not something that he feels is right. B, God never told him to do so. So isn't it an amazing thing that God gives him these promises, but David doesn't take matters into his own hands? In fact, he seems to defer to Saul at every conceivable point. And it's just it speaks so much about his character. He's, again, a fascinating, complex guy. Well, David restrained his servants, verse 7, with these words, and God did not allow them to rise against Saul, and Saul got up from the cave and went on his way. Now David also arose afterward, went out of the cave, and called out to Saul, saying, My lord the king. Now, what it must mean is that there was some distance between them, because, oddly enough, even at that, you just kind of wonder, how far could he get that they're still within shouting distance? But David would have to wonder, man, if they come back at us, what are we going to do? He's got more people than we do, and probably way better trained and equipped and everything else. And David, it's a bold thing that David does here. So he ends up saying, David rose afterward, went out of the cave, called out to Saul, said, My lord the king. Saul looked behind him, and David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed down. So there was some amount of eyesight from some distance. And David said, Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Indeed, David seeks your harm? Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you into my hand in that cave. And someone urged me to kill you, but my eye spared you. And I said, I will not stretch out my hand against the Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Now think, this is David kind of appealing to Saul's shame. I had the opportunity. People were even urging me to take you out, but I wouldn't do that. Now, again, the first of these things that he gives is the reason. He says, because you're the one that God has in place. You are the anointed king over Israel. Who am I that I would do such a thing like that? Again, this is just such an important integrity kind of thing. Now, let me stop here for just a moment, because oftentimes, oh my gosh, how many times do we hear from these preachers that would tell us, whenever somebody's concerned about what they do, what they teach, how they conduct themselves, that the first thing that gets thrown back to us is, touch not God's anointed. Well, what a ridiculous thing to say, first of all, because the anointed that's being spoken of there, that they like to quote from the Bible, is dealing with the kings of Israel. And I don't care who you are, Mr. Preacher Man, you are not the anointed of the kings of Israel. So it's just a horrible misapplication of the passage. And then I would have to also say, just because you're a pastor, I don't even care how big your church is or your worldwide ministry, I don't trust that you're God's anointed based on what you teach. So if you ever hear people say that, touch not God's anointed, I mean, I've even heard people that I respect try to say that. Let's make sure that we understand the context. Now, again, at the same time, we want to be careful if God has put somebody in a place of authority, and if we have a personality thing with them, we want to be careful about that. But if God has anointed them as a teacher and they're faithful to teaching the Word of God, regardless of how we may feel about them on a personal level, or a personality level is probably a better way of saying it, as long as their doctrine is sound, and then we can say that God uses them and teaches them, and that his anointing or his empowering and his equipping is upon them, we should be careful about that. But at the same time, if they like to throw that out there, I want to say, well, let's determine whether or not you're actually even anointed, and then we can start talking about whether or not I want to pay attention to what you have to say. All right, with all that said, why do you listen to the words of men? Look, this day my eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you, verse 10. So that in verse 11, moreover, my father, look at him, he just looks at him as this authority figure, like you're a father figure to me. Look, he says, look and see this. Yes, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the corner of your robe, but I did not kill you. So know and see that there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand, and I have not sinned against you. Yet you hunt me and take my life. So, an interesting thing. He just wants Saul to understand and kind of come to grips with what he's doing here. So David doesn't seem in any way fearful, nor should he be. I mean, God's ultimately in control. But he wants Saul to understand, why is it that you pursue after me? He wants Saul to see it, and I think to some extent David wants to go, help me understand this. Take a look at your robe, and look what I have right here in my hand. When you were in that cave, I had every opportunity to take your life. I would never do it because you're God's anointed. But look at it for yourself. Now he puts it on to Saul to have to come to grips with this. David has already come to grips. Who am I that I would touch God's anointed? Now David puts Saul in a place of, you need to come to grips with this too. I've never done anything other than serve you as the king in this nation, and I even had the opportunity to take your life, and you didn't even know it. Here is the evidence right here. Would have been a very powerful thing. And we see by Saul's reaction that he's quite taken by this whole thing. And of course, we know it's going to be short-lived. He's Saul, right? Well, so he says in verse 12, let the Lord then judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you. I'm just not going to do this. Let the Lord decide who's right here. I'm not coming after you. I never will. So, verse 13, as the proverb of the ancients say, wickedness proceeds from the wicked, but my hand shall not be against you. So this was just kind of, it's not Proverbs. Clearly those were written after David. But the proverb that's being spoken of is just a way of, it's like the old, we would use a term like this. That's like the old saying goes. David's basically to say the same thing. It's like we all know this to be a truth. This is a truism. It's a proverb that wicked people produce wickedness. That's just kind of the way we would put it in our modern English. And so he says, so if I'm wicked and I'm not doing wicked things, something's wrong in your assessment of me. I don't do wickedness towards you, Saul. So this proverb that is known, this truism. Now, verse 14 says, after whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom do you pursue? A dog? A flea? That's David's assessing who he is with the men that he has and the ability to make war, as opposed to the king of Israel with his 3,000 men. So he's looking at Saul and saying, you're coming after me as though I'm some kind of a threat, but what am I to you? Ultimately, logically, what am I, a flea, a dog to you, by comparison to what you have? Again, it's appealing to Saul's shame, and it should be enough, but of course, like I said before, he's Saul, so it's never enough. Therefore, let the Lord be judge, and judge between you and me, and see and plead my case, and deliver me out of your hand. And so it was, when David had finished speaking these words to Saul, that Saul said, is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and he wept. Now, again, this sounds really, really good. It's like, finally he's seeing this. Now, here's a question. Is he disingenuous? My guess is that he's probably pretty humbled by this point. And I have no reason to think that he's anything other than genuine at this point. And I think he was probably in other times as well, when, circumstances proved otherwise to his own paranoia and anger and jealousy. I think we have another one of those situations here where he really is genuine at this point. It just won't last because he's that kind of a character, because he's that sick in the head, and because he's that jealous of David, and he's just out of his mind. But look at what he says here, and again, I have no reason to think it's not genuine. So then he said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me with good, whereas I have rewarded you with evil. Now, this verse 17 is an absolute, perfect one sentence or one verse way of describing the dynamics between the two of them. Saul has always, from the time that he interacted with him, he's always just been jealous and had evil things towards David, but David was always the total counter to that towards Saul. And again, it's because David had a respect, first of all, this is very important for us too, David had a respect first and foremost to the Lord. He realized that Saul as king should be an extension of who the Lord is, and that though it wasn't his desire to have a king, God would have led the nation by a king, even as a, not my best option here, but I'll honor the things that you people are doing and I will lead you through a king. Well, David sees that should be the potential, and he realizes that Saul's not that person, but he doesn't take it into his own hands to do something about it. And David says, I've always done good by you, and the reverse is true with you. So, in verse 18 again, and you have shown this day how you have dealt well with me, for when the Lord delivered me into your hand, you did not kill me. Saul has to admit the obvious here. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safely? Therefore, may the Lord reward you with good, and what you have done for what you have done to me this day. And now I know indeed that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. Now, if it wasn't clear to him before, it is now again clear to him, because already by this time Saul knows this. Samuel's told him. look, there's already a king that's anointed. God doesn't recognize you anymore. I won't recognize you anymore. Your days are numbered. But it wasn't like a few weeks. Think about how long it's dragged on since that first was revealed to him. So Samuel has long since withdrawn himself from Saul and limited even the amount of time that he has with David, but he loves David, and David loves Samuel. But Saul is kind of on the outside looking in, and here it is once again brought to him. He's obviously seeing this truth. David, you're going to be that person, and I am not. He sees it clearly at this point. Well, we see, therefore, verse 21, swear now to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's house. And so David swore to Saul, and Saul went home. David went up to his stronghold. Notice that unlike other times when they've tried to reconcile some things, David would come back for a while, and then Saul would look to kill him. In this case, Saul goes back to where he came from, north of Jerusalem. David stays kind of in that area where he was in the stronghold area. It doesn't say a whole lot. Could be En Gedi, could be one of the other places there he had been. But David is kind of cautious, of course. And now notice, again, isn't it funny that Saul is concerned about his heritage, his kids after him? Meanwhile, he's so blinded by everything, he doesn't even realize that Jonathan and David have already worked these things out. And David has no ill will towards Saul, even at this point, let alone his family. Now, with everything that Saul has done to this point, you would read there at chapter 24. If you didn't know the rest of the story, and you'd think, great, finally Saul has realized his folly, and he's going to somehow get it together. And so he's going to quit pursuing David. David's proven once and for all that he has no intention of doing any ill thing towards him, so maybe they can get this thing all worked out. Well, the first glimpse that there's still really a problem is that David won't go where Saul is. Interesting. Now, of course, it shouldn't be a surprise, but that's just where it's left off in this part of the story. So, as it goes on, chapter 25, it says, now Samuel died, and the Israelites gathered together, and they lamented for him. They buried him at his home in Ramah, and David arose and he went down to the wilderness of Paran. And now that gives us an idea of where he had stopped. And so this is also, all this area is kind of still very close. It's in the south. Where David has gone from place to place is really not very far. It's all kind of in the same proximity. But you'll notice in verse 2 it says, now there was a man of Maon whose business was in Carmel. Now this is not the Carmel up in the north that we can tell. There's a Carmel, not like the Mount Carmel, but Carmel, a place known by that name down towards the south where he is. And it's a guy who's very wealthy, as we see here. And the man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep at Carmel. And the name of the man was Nabal, and his wife was Abigail, and she was a woman of good understanding, beautiful in appearance, but the man was harsh and evil in his doings, and he was of the house of Caleb. And so the house of Caleb, if you remember, Caleb went and dwelt in the area of Judah, kind of more where David is, that kind of mountainous area. It's below Jerusalem and a little bit to the east, but that's where Caleb wanted to settle. And so he's from that line of Caleb. Now, Caleb as in Joshua and Caleb when they come into the land. All right. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, go up to Carmel, go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you will say to him who lives in prosperity, peace be to you, peace be to your house, and peace to all that you have. And now I have heard that you have shears, and your shepherds were with us, and we did not hurt them, nor was there anything missing from them in all the while that they were in Carmel. And so when David had these people around him, if you remember that time we just read about in the last couple of chapters, this things that this man had, it brought those people who served Nabal into direct contact with David and with his people. And David is now looking for some help from Nabal, and basically says, when we had the opportunity, we could have taken all these things by force from your people. Instead, we treated them very well. David is looking for this man to repay his kindness. That's all that it is, not a whole lot more to it. So here's what you're going to say to him in verse 6, the one who lives in prosperity, peace be to you, to your house, and peace to all that you have. And now I have heard that you have shears, and your shepherds came with us, and we did no harm to them in Carmel. Okay, so that's verse 7. So verse 8, now ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we have come on a feast day. So please give whatever comes to your hand to your servants and to your son David. And when David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all these words of David, in the name of David, and so they waited. Now, Nabal doesn't do the one thing. Hey, just go ask your guys. They'll vouch for this, and they know one another. Your guys will be able to say that this is actually true. Did David's people treat you well? Did you have interaction with them? Is this a good thing that we should do to recompense? And he didn't do any of those things. David gave him, if you don't want to just trust these guys here, ask your own people. And it should have been enough. That would have done it. Now, Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David? And who is this son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away from each other and from his master. So then should I take my bread and my water and my meat and that I have and killed for my shears and then give it to men that I don't know where they are from? See, again, David gave him the instruction, ask your own guys, they'll tell you. Instead, he uses that as an excuse to say, well, people break away all the time. You could be just telling me a lie. I'm not going to give you any of the things that I give to my people. Had he done what was prescribed, ask your own people, they'll vouch for us. He could have avoided all this, but we know about him. He's an evil guy. So, verse 12, so David's young men turned on their heels, went back, and they came and they told David all these words. And so David said to his men, everyone gird with your sword. So every man girded on his sword, put on their sword, basically girded, put it on. And David also put on his, and about 400 men went with David, and 200 stayed with the supply. So that basically tells you David has 600 guys. Remember, he had faced Saul with 3,000 of their best. That gives you an idea of the types of people. Now, one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, look, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he reviled them. But the men were very good to us, and we were not hurt, nor did we miss anything as long as we accompanied them when they were in the fields. So here is Abigail getting the report that should have been requested by Nabal and would have avoided all of what's about to happen. So Abigail hears this and thinks, we've done something terribly wrong. My husband's done something terribly wrong. Now she's looking to try to preserve herself and everybody else that's there. At this point, you kind of get the impression that, well, whatever happens to Nabal happens to him, but we've got to make sure that doesn't wipe out the rest of us. Let's go talk to David. Let's bring him what he has requested. So they were a wall to us both by night and day, all the time that we were with them, keeping the sheep. Now, therefore, know and consider what you do, for harm is determined against our master and against all of his household, for he is such a scoundrel, means a son of Belial, which is he's demonic. Interesting way. So one cannot even speak to him. Now, the interesting thing is that they realize this is going to really go poorly for us, but they say not only were they nice to us, they were a wall around us. It means that David kept them secure as they attended the sheep. Things that don't even belong to David. David kind of felt obligated to do this. It was a kind gesture. It's a countryman. So they made sure that they were taken care of. So Abigail made haste, took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already dressed, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. And then she said to her servants, go on before me. See, I am coming after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And so it was, as she rode on the donkey, that she went down under cover of the hill, and there was David and his men coming down toward her, and she met them. So, boy, they meet one another on the road. Interesting, the exchange that goes on here, because, yeah, David looks at it's not just that he was disrespected by Nabal, but Nabal probably, as we would see here, the reason why he would come after Nabal the way he did, Nabal's made himself now an enemy. And especially with all the things that Saul has done, this would probably put David in the place of saying, we've got to do something about this. Because we've come out of kindness, but we haven't had kindness reciprocated here, so there's got to be something more going on here. Now David's going to retaliate. So, now David had said, surely in vain I have protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness. This is verse 21. Again, verse 21. They see one another on the road. David said, surely in vain I have protected all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belongs to him, and he has repaid me evil for good. May God do so and more also to the enemies of David, if I leave one male of all who belong to him by morning. Because so David basically sees, why the men? Well, because he sees that Nabal has ill intent. Whether Nabal would have followed through with anything, David says, I've got to neutralize the threat. The guys are getting taken out here. Well, in verse 23, now when Abigail saw David, she dismounted quickly from the donkey, fell to her face before David, and bowed to the ground. And so she fell at his feet and said, on me, my lord, on me let this iniquity be. And please let your maidservant speak in your ears, and hear the words of your maidservant. Please let not my lord regard the scoundrel Nabal. She's talking about her husband. For as his name is, so is he. Nabal means foolish, a fool. You would think, man, I think if somebody gave me the name fool, I'd want to go to get a name change. But anyway, it means foolish. So anyway, that's his name. In his name and folly, it is all on him, or it's with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young men of my lord whom you sent. So she's wanting to say, I don't want to have any part of this. She gives an offering as it should have been given to him in the first place. And she said, I wasn't even there to hear what your guys said. This is her way of saying, this information came to me secondhand, but she's doing the right thing. So please let not my lord regard this scoundrel Nabal. Now, verse 26, now therefore, my lord, as the Lord lives and your soul lives, since the Lord has held you back from coming to bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek harm for my lord be as Nabal. And now this present which your maidservant has brought to my lord, let it be given to the young men who follow my lord, who follow you, David. So it's a lot of words of basically saying, I'm going to make good on what you requested of Nabal. And whatever becomes of him becomes of him. But to do rightly by you is to do rightly by you. You did right by us. We're doing right by you. Don't let this fall on the rest of us. This is really solely on Nabal. Well, verse 28, please forgive the trespass of your maidservant, for the Lord will certainly make for my Lord an enduring house. Now, this is a way of saying she sees him Lord, little L. That's, the master, if you will. But Lord, as in God, she basically said, the Lord's going to make you my Lord, king over the nation. She recognizes what's going on here, and she's very careful to realize this. And evil is not found in you throughout all of your days. Verse 28. Now, verse 29 says, yet a man has risen to pursue you and to seek your life, but the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God, and the lives of your enemies he will sling out as from the pocket of a sling. It's kind of a prophetic thing that she says. And this is a way of saying, Saul, I know what he's done. I know what he's after you. And just know this. She's able to speak this to David and basically say, harm's not going to come to you. The Lord's hand is upon you. And the people that pursue after you are going to be jettisoned. They're going to be slung like a stone from a sling. Pretty interesting that she says this. Neat prophetic stuff that she says. Now, it shall come to pass when the Lord has done good for my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and he has appointed you to be ruler over Israel, that this will be no grief to you, nor offense of heart to my Lord, either that you have shed blood without cause, or that my Lord has avenged himself. But when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your maidservant. So her whole thing is very similar to what Saul had asked of his family when David comes in before he goes nuts again, or what Jonathan said too. Let there be peace between us. She's basically doing the same thing. I don't see you as an adversary, never have. Nabal is a different story, but she's saying just remember my kindness to you, because, wanting to make sure that you're in good standing with the king. But David is nothing like Saul. Saul would have been that kind that would have looked for people to, do all the things that are, people pledging themselves to him rather than to the Lord and to the nation. She sees him as a much different person, pledges herself to him. Verse 32, then David said to Abigail, "Blessed is the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. And blessed is your advice, and blessed are you, because you have kept me this day from coming to bloodshed and from avenging myself with my own hand." And he sees this. Think about this. It's a really cool thing. People love power. And the idea of getting power is that you take it from someone else. It's just the way that man does things. And so here he says, I am so thankful that God sent you, because I don't have to be brought to the place of bloodshed today. Everything is as it should be. And he sees that as that God has intervened, and he's thankful for it. Well, verse 34, "For indeed, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has kept me back from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, surely by morning light, no males would have been left to Nabal." And so David received from her hand, and she brought him and said to her, "Go up in peace to your house. See, I have heeded your voice and respected your person. I'm going to do everything that you asked. So I'll turn back. Thank you for the gifts. This is all that I had ever asked for, and probably a lot more from the sounds of what she gave him." He goes back to where he does. She's able to go back in peace. Now she's going to let her husband know what just took place. So Abigail, she went to Nabal, and there he was, holding a feast in his house, like the feast for a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, and he was very drunk. Therefore she told him nothing, little or much, until morning light. And so it was in the morning, when the wine was gone from Nabal, that his wife told him of these things, that his heart died within him, and he became like a stone. And so it happened after that, about 10 days, that the Lord struck Nabal and he died. Now, some people would say, become like a stone, his heart died within him. That, they're trying to say, is this just a fanciful way of saying he had a stroke? He was so freaked out by what he heard, and it was so distressing to him. It's not that his wife gave him stuff, he had plenty. But he realized that he could just easily be dead, and it had the effect on him of like turning him to stone. Now, it's not one of those things he's going to recover from anyways, because we see here within 10 days he's done. God judged him for what he had done, just his wickedness and his evil. Well, verse 39, "So when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has pleaded the case of my reproach from the hand of Nabal, and he has kept his servant from evil.' So the Lord had returned the wickedness of Nabal on his own head, and David sent and proposed to Abigail to take her as wife." So again, there's more than just he was thankful. Now he sees Nabal or not Nabal, now that Nabal's gone, that his wife Abigail, a very decent woman as he sees. Obviously it says that she's beautiful. That would probably make it better as far as David's concerned. But he sees somebody like this as somebody that he wants to take as wife. Now, what we're getting here is just kind of a little bit of narration, I guess you could say, kind of an after the fact of little bits and pieces, kind of almost you could say housekeeping details. "So when the servants of David had come to Abigail at Carmel, they spoke to her, saying, 'David sent us to you to ask you to become his wife.' And then she arose, bowed her face to the earth, and said, 'Here is your maidservant, and a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord.'" So she said, I'll humbly do what even a servant does, and yet she's going to be made wife. So Abigail rose in haste, rode on a donkey, attended by 5 of her maidens, and she followed the messengers of David and became his wife. Interesting that she's still, obviously this is a person of great substance. She has 5 people serving her, and her husband was, it says, quite wealthy. Well, it says in verse 43, David also took Ahinoam, of Jezreel, and so both of them became his wives. This is just, again, it's anecdotal, just little information. Doesn't have anything to do with the story. It's just he's takes to himself two wives, and look at what Saul does in this punitive sense. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife. At this point, he had given her to Palti, the son of Laish, who was from Galim. Now, this is just a way of kind of tying up some loose ends, I guess you could say, and giving a little bit of detail about what happened after this. And Abigail became wife. Michal, just in a punitive sense, that God took her and gave her to someone else, and so David's wife was taken from him. Again, this is just the intrigues between Saul and David. It's just such an ugly thing. With all of that said, we're getting to the latter parts of this book, and we're getting to the part, actually we probably won't get there this next week. It'll take us another couple of weeks to finish out this book, but it leads to ultimately the death of Saul, and it'll be to the beginning of the rise of David that we get in 2 Samuel. So with that said, again, if you have any questions about what we've looked at here, if you have any difficulty seeing the maps that we put up or having trouble screen capturing it, you can always let us know. Send us an email. I'll be happy to send them to you in email. They're not that big that you can't send them. And we just want to make sure that we're familiar with the area where we're talking about, because it does play into the history and gives us an idea of how far they would go. And if you're like me, you like looking at maps and those kind of things. Where is this place and where did it happen? So with all of that said, again, if you have any questions about anything in the ministry, we love to hear from you. You can contact us through the church, or through the ministry rather, the email of the ministry. That's found at the website, which is oldpaththeology.net. And we love to hear from you again. And also, if you're watching this on YouTube and you haven't had a chance to subscribe, it's a great way to keep up when we're putting up content. We have some talking points that we put up, topical things. I'll be adding a couple more this week that have come up that I've wanted to be recording, and be looking for that content as well. We have a Through the Bible New Testament study that we do as well. We are currently in the Gospel of John. We do those on Thursdays. These come up on Mondays in the Old Testament, and we'd love to have you join along with us. We believe, especially in troubled times as I think we are in, the thing that helps to settle the mind the most is that time that we can spend seeking God through His Word. And the best way to understand His will and what we can know about Him is to know the entirety of His Word, Old and New Testament alike. So with all that said, until next week or till Wednesday or whenever you tune back in on the channel, we hope that God blesses you as you pursue Him through His Word.